All right, so we're going to speak today about this broader idea of potentia. I reference this tremendously in my work, and those of you that have seen some of my stuff on Twitter will be aware of the term being thrown around a good deal. I'm going to really deep dive into what I mean by potentia, the origin of potentia, the relevance of the idea of potentia at the dawn of artificial general intelligence. I kind of hit it top to bottom. Sometimes I'm going to speak a little bit more just freely directly at the camera. Sometimes I might read individual paragraphs one to one if I think they're crystalline and important for the explanation of the concept itself. But we'll just basically fly in. Basically open here with talking about kind of like what the end of artificial general intelligence should be. Sort of what is the goal? And of course, in the worthy successor, this is answered. But what is posited at the beginning of this article and what I will be aiming to sort of suss out and sort of make the case for over the course of this video and in the article that you'll see on screen is that the highest moral goal for humanity is sustainably expanding potentia itself, which would be key to conjuring the worthy successor. That's essentially what's going to be argued here. So we'll get a little bit into like what the term means, and then we'll get boots on the ground about its implications, ramifications, and why I consider it to be primary of all things to be preserved and expanded into the future, because it is essentially the seed of all preservation and all expansion itself. So let's just talk about it conceptually. So in the 1680s, Newton laid out sort of the way that dead matter behaves in his Principia. Around a decade later, Spinoza laid out some very strong principles of how living matter behave. So organisms, organizations in his ethics. Spinoza's ethics is pretty robust and complicated. I certainly have not read it in its original Latin, but he lays out these ideas of conatus and potentia. And personally, I consider sort of those core ideas of conatus, potentia, and sort of what we can expect in terms of behavior from non-dead matter to be kind of almost as important as what Newton laid out in terms of the behavior of dead matter in terms of physics a handful of years earlier. So we'll get into what these concepts actually are. So the conatus for Spinoza refers to an innate drive of all living things to persist and survive. So persist doesn't mean stay the same for eternity. Persist means change if you must, but make sure that you don't die, you don't perish, your line doesn't end. This is something that he sees as kind of crucial. Now, of course, he didn't have a Darwinian stance here because Darwin, would not be born for another 100 and however many years. But he did essentially see through this, even without sort of evolutionary underpinnings. This idea that sort of if something is alive, if we can look at something and it's alive, if it's going to stay alive, then its core mandate almost certainly is to stay alive. So if we see a flower blooming, more important even than the blooming of the flower should be it staying alive. And presumably the blooming itself is part of how it stays alive. If we see a rodent digging in a burrow, presumably digging is less important than staying alive and is probably instrumental to staying alive in some way, shape, or form. So conatus is that core impetus of a thing to not perish. It seems that living stuff does this. I'm not exactly sure why, but it kind of makes sense. Again, evolutionarily, you can think about the first little wiggling protein, the first single-celled organisms. The first single-celled organisms, number one, they probably wouldn't have even come together and become a thing if there wasn't this drive to persist. But let's just say they did. Let's say single-celled organisms just fell from the heavens. They plopped down and random smattering of DNA, a random smattering of kind of preferences and goals and behaviors. There would have been some of them for whom non-death and persistence would be primary, and there would be others that, I don't know, maybe they just like doing stuff, just kind of fucking around. The ones that sort of focused on not dying, we would presume would be the ones that we would still see around. So the things that behoove non-death and have that as primary, because you cannot start over when you die, those things we would expect to see sort of be the victors. And so if that started at the very smallest levels of life, we could look out at the trees in my backyard, we could look at the biggest animals in the world or the smallest animals in the world, and we would expect exactly the same thing. We could even extend it to organizations or nations, bundles of people. Things start to get more abstract. I'm a bundle of cells. The town of Weston, Massachusetts is a bundle of humans. IBM Corporation is a bundle of humans. The startup down the street is a bundle of humans. Organizations, we would expect to sort of have persistence as their core mandate. And if they don't, we would expect them to stop persisting pretty quick. And all the things we see around us that are persisting probably have as essentially their first mandate, non-death. So persistence. So potentia for Spinoza, I believe, can be expressed as the total range and capability space of an agent that permits it to not die. So everything that serves the conatus is potentia. All powers are potentia. So potentia could include, let us look at the list here: photosynthesis, sharp claws, hard shells, physical strength, a sense of smell, of taste, of sight, burrowing into the ground, walking, flying, swimming, camouflage, being poisonous, infrared vision, conscious thought, any degree of tool use, blah, 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 but we could go on and on and on. And the conatus is wielding this potentia in order to not die. There was some time where nothing on earth had a hard shell, and then something grew a hard shell. Why, you might ask? Certainly, random mutation may be part of it, no doubt about that. But the shell continued to form because it kept behooving the persistence of the thing that was doing the shelling. And so shells emerged as potentia. The sense of sight emerged as potentia. It behooved something to see in order to not die. Same thing with consciousness. So this magical, amazing thing of consciousness, for all we know, it permeates the very granite stones outside, again, in my backyard here. But at least in biology, from what we can tell, consciousness seems to emerge with enough concentration of nerves, potentially cephalized animals that have heads, wherever we want to draw the line. Some people would say, the clam is not conscious. Some people think maybe it is for XYZ reasons. Draw the line wherever you want. I don't really care, honestly. Through biology, consciousness at some point emerged. And it emerged, we might imagine, non-randomly. It emerged and developed because it behooved the non-death of the things that were conscious. So it behooved something to know that its prey went behind a rock. And it behooved something else to know that its predator was hiding behind that rock. So to play these little mental movies and have this field of awareness where small degrees of prediction and decision could be made in this sort of inner theater, clearly behooved the non-death of a set of creatures. But think about what this implies. What this implies is that the great moral bedrock that I think we could probably all agree on, right? Some of you might like virtue ethics or some kind of Kantian deontology, whatever your ethical theories. Most of you, if held down and jammed with a hot poker enough times, would probably say, stop. Because you would not prefer that degree of negative qualia. Some of you, after being starved for long periods of time, would consume food and say, by golly, this is neato. This is real nice. Because there are things that are pleasurable and positive qualia seems to be a net good. And so the least debatable of the moral kind of goods or ills, this sentience, popped up. So think about the conatus in the middle, potentia is kind of expanding. At some point, we just hit a treasure chest. There's this treasure chest of consciousness just came out of nowhere. Did it come from, did God come down and gift consciousness? Hear, ye animals, consciousness ye have, the highest of all possible goods, the eternal of all possible goods. It is now with you, I leave. And then he left. Was that what happened? I suspect it wasn't. I suspect consciousness bubbled up into potentia to behoove the non-death of something where something that was helped by being conscious. So what does this mean? Well, there's some really important implications if we just kind of check out the screen here. So what's marvelous in this case, and really hard to appreciate, is that all forms of potentia we now see emerged from nothing. So we talked about senses, we talked about consciousness, all of that. This is what is again marvelous. and hard to appreciate, is that most possible types of potentia have not yet emerged. There are kinds of movement and dexterity and strength and speed in the physical world that humans can't even imagine, but that one day will emerge forth as the conatus demands new ways to behoove its aim. Again, as new potentia emerges. There are likely to be senses, wholly different from sight, hearing, touch, that we humans can't even imagine, that one day will emerge by the conatus because it wants to not die. There's likely something beyond consciousness, some kind of meta-consciousness or connectedness to thinking or understanding that we literally, again, can't even imagine. Just as a sea snail cannot imagine what I'm saying in this YouTube video, just as your Labrador retriever cannot understand, the pillars and tenets of Marxism, we could not even begin to scratch the conception of what these future experiences could be. In other words, the treasure chest of consciousness popped open because potentia expanded, and there are more pops to occur. An infinite magazine of pops that may be available to occur. And the possibility of that, which I would rate as a very high likelihood, the total state space of minds has a massive total state space of potentia and potential value to bubble into. It is a moral mandate to expand that. And we're going to talk about how that ties to survival and some other things in a bit here. So think about it like this. Conatus sits at the center. There is this central impulse that just says, I wish not to die. And that's the central impulse. And if it's not the central impulse, that thing will just end up dying. That's okay. It just dies. And then something else that actually doesn't want to die will take its place. And this is what nature is, kind of. The conatus sits in the middle, and then potentia blossoms out of the conatus and sticks its tendrils in different directions to develop new powers. Again, hard shells, tool use, conscious thought, romantic love, whatever powers and experiences bubble out of the conatus to behoove the survival of the entity, they bubble out. So we look at the image here that's on screen. We can imagine potentia as a kind of cloud of powers that help to keep an entity alive. Beyond that cloud is maybe a bit more space of potentia that is imaginable by humans. So if you look at the key down at the bottom, we've got all the colors labeled. So yellow is kind of this infinite state space of additional potentia. Pink would be like potentia that humans can imagine, like things that we can understand. And then blue would be potentia that currently exists. So there's potentia that exists in the world, and then there's potentia that we could imagine. And then there's an infinite span vastly beyond what we could imagine in all conceivable directions. If we go to the second image, but the state space of potentia is likely only started to emerge, and we don't know what other potentia could emerge in spaces that we can't access. If we go to the very bottom image here, the very bottom slot of the image, and it seems likely that not only is the future extent of all kinds of potentia infinite, but the varieties of potentia itself may be infinite as well. So we look at the conatus in that bottom image, and there's only this tiny little nub of potentia that's bubbled out of the conatus. This is a tiny little nub in this infinite state space. So we might think, as we look out in the world as humans, what we think to ourselves is the following. Why, surely all of which I could experience is the totality of what is even experienceable. Surely there is nothing beyond my conception and my ideas. Surely all possible goods, all possible powers, and all possible experiences are accessible to me, or they are just a greater extent of something which I already understand. I consider this to be not just almost certainly kind of factually wrong, but as we'll get to, very, very morally wrong as a position to hold. And that in fact, we are a tiny prick of potentia that is bubbled out of the core conatus, and there is an infinite state space of magazines of unraveling potentia, power, experience, and value that can unravel beyond our present conception. But it springs forth from the conatus, and we'll return to survival in a little bit. We'll just keep moving down with our article here. So just as humans are grateful to have humor, love, art, and all the things horseshoe crabs don't have, future intelligence will feel the same way. They will swim in new realms of potentia that will be infinitely glad to not be limited to human experiences and capabilities. I'm grateful I'm not a sea snail or a horseshoe crab. Whatever is after us, should it be a worthy successor, which we'll get to, would very much be grateful that it's not hampered and limited to us. It would have thousands of times the number of senses that we have. It would have potentially vast, wider swaths of goals it could pursue, understanding of nature that it could master, objectives that it could hold in its mind that we couldn't even conceive of, that are more valuable than the things we can conceive of, higher and more important goals than what we could conceive of. So I think about it like this. The conatus is the central necessary drive of all cells, organisms, organization, the impetus to persist. And the conatus cannot just grow a shell, play defense, and be done with it. Survival implies action, exploration, the expansion of its powers in order to deal with new forces, new adversaries, most of which are completely unknown. There are not only known adversaries, there are an infinite army of unknown adversaries, cosmic events, alien intelligence, who knows what else, physical forces we haven't even detected yet that we're going to come into contact with in some way, shape, or form. And so potentia is that set of powers that the conatus gradually develops. It is the metaphorical arms and legs shooting out to do its work, do its bidding of not dying. This is what potentia is. And that what makes us morally valuable is the grand extents of potentia that has bubbled up through us. You might say, Daniel, to me, what makes humans valuable is our ability to love and be compassionate, our ability to have fun, or our ability to make people laugh, or I don't know, people have like really goofball ideas about this, but like whatever yours are, okay? It's perfectly fine, whatever yours are. Those are all things that sort of in some way, shape, or form bubbled up to behoove our survival. I think it's delightful that I can eat food and not be on the verge of starvation, that I can, have romantic relationships without it just being about scrambling to have a couple kids before some kind of a saber-toothed tiger kills me. I think it's great that like we've bubbled beyond the brute needs of survival on the day-to-day, but it's ridiculous to suspect that those bubbling out of powers have not been related to survival. Technological extrapolations of our potentia, so this microphone, this camera, this amazing computer that I'm on right now, this smartphone sitting to the left of me, all of these things are extensions of our potentia, and they allow us to wield more power. So we have technological extensions, we have cultural extensions, we are a biological extension up from lower species or species before us. And this is, I think, the way to think about it. So let's look at a couple more sort of images here. So it's inherently hard to visualize unimaginable powers, but we can try to imagine current qualities that we might understand, like size, senses, abilities, and extend those into new posthuman destinations, or dimensions. So you could pause on this graphic if you so choose. I'll read a few things from the graphic and then we will move on. I'm not going to read every cell for you, but feel free to pause or go to danfagello.com/potentia, which will be linked at the bottom, and you can read the article and check it out for yourself. So, let's just look at form. So real current forms today are like a hard shell, sharp claws, 8 tentacles with suckers, gelatinous slime molds, etc. Imaginable forms might be an entity composed of electrical fields existing in otherwise inert matter, an entity built from genetic material other than DNA with a totally different base. And then unimaginable forms might be entities that exist in ways that occupy atoms in millions of galaxies at once, or don't hold form at all, but somehow exist in a kind of frequency only without any proxy for physical shape, etc. We could see how any sort of thing that we can imagine can be stretched into the unimaginable, just as much of what we do is unimaginable to the nematode. We could move on to something like sensory. So, what are the things that are real in the world of senses? We have sight, we have sound, we have proprioception, we have some animals that can see infrared, or we have technology that lets us see infrared. We have taste, we have like electric fields like sharks can use, we have hearing, etc. What are some imaginable senses? Well, maybe we have the reading of thoughts through BCI. We're kind of getting closer to that, but we're not quite there, right? I can't have you wear a headset and know every damn word running through your head. We're not there yet, but maybe we'll be there relatively soon. Who knows? Being able to see in infrared, sensing the heartbeat of other animals. There's all kind of like imaginable senses that maybe we could have. And then there's like unimaginable senses, where entities may exist with literally a billion senses, rich and complete and requiring kinds of access to reality that we can't even conceive of. things that don't even involve sense organs. They involve like access to dimensional entities or strata of reality for which we have no proxy for in any way, shape, or form, but are kind of like meta senses, right? These things are sort of stretching into the unimaginable. In every domain that we could conceive of, from consciousness to size to form to abilities, to cognition, as you can see here, these stretch into domains that we can't conceive of. And then there are magazines of entirely new strata of powers that we don't even have words for because we don't know them. So on this list here, you'll see conscious, or you'll see cognitive, something like that. Presumably, if you are a barnacle, you would not, maybe you have some senses and you certainly have some kind of form, but you don't have conscious and cognitive. Those are not even on your list of what it's not even there. Those magazines opened up as life bubbled up from the barnacle to the man. And those magazines and new dimensions will continue to unravel. We might even imagine dimensions of potentia, extending out through the human world. So we can be a little anthropocentric with our goggles for a second, which I don't traditionally like to do, but it makes ideas more accessible sometimes. So let's take a look here. We can see in biology, so over the course of time, so down our left-hand side here, we see the course of time. Over the course of time, biology has unlocked new magazines of potentia over time. So we had, flagella locomotion, which some people, it's pretty similar to my last name there, oddly enough, although there's no connection there from what I understand. Predation, photosynthesis, there's some stuff that was like 1 billion years old. And then we go to 500 million, there's more powers. We go to 100,000, there's more powers. 1500 AD to 2024 AD, there's not really a lot of change. Biological sets of powers aren't really actually that different than they were 100,000 years ago. But cultural actually has been lifting off. So biological potentia unravels rather slowly. Cultural is a little quicker. So, we have things like language and, teaching skills like foraging and hunting and, understanding the stars or whatever. We have, universities emerge, monarchies and democracy and different forms of nation states, et cetera. And by 1500 AD, we certainly didn't have democracy in 100,000 BC. 2024, we have modern economies. We have the idea of human rights, not exactly a popular idea in 1500, and not a lot of really robust thinking about that one back then. We have the idea of love marriage. We have international trade law. All sorts of things on the cultural side that just didn't exist. Culture kind of bubbles up powers actually rather quickly compared to biology. Then we look at technological. 100,000 BC, we had fire and the hand axe, maybe. Just a blunt tool that we could kind of strike to, chop meat or club an enemy to death or whatever the case may be. You go to 1500. You got the printing press, you got firearms, you got sailboats, you got astrolabes, you got all kinds of cool stuff. And then you go to 2024 and it's like ridiculous. I mean, we just have unbounded, insane degrees of potentia expansion from technology. And here's the deal. Biological, cultural, technical. People like to pretend that it ends with technical, but there are clearly domains that are post-technical. There are things that we couldn't even really say are like technology anymore. They're like other strata and paradigms. So understand, the prairie dog does not have a technical extension of its potentia. The chimpanzee has a little bit of a cultural one, a little bit of a cultural one, but like not really a technical one. So potentia has bubbled up to man, and now we have this cultural realm, we have this technological realm. But there are other realms for which we have no words. You see, these are unknown domains. There are magazines of other domains where potentia might unravel even faster than they do in technology, than they do in culture, certainly than they do in biology, for which we have no names and we maybe have no ability to even imagine. Similarly, what would happen by the year 3000? In biology, if we use technology with biology, maybe biology will get interesting. But the next 1,000 years in pure biology, evolution, just kind of sit here, look at your watch, see if the frogs in the pond back there, grow 4 legs instead of 4 back legs instead of 2 back legs or something. I don't really, not a lot of interesting stuff would happen. But culturally and technologically, a lot would happen. By the year 1,000,000 AD, we couldn't even imagine where cultural and technological change would take us, never mind those unloading magazines of new dimensions of power. One more image I'll just put on the screen to give you guys an idea. There's a lot of ways to visualize this. Again, what are we doing here? We're trying to visualize the unimaginable. It's admittedly a challenging task. You can see I'm giving it a shot. So, God bless my soul. I'm giving it a little bit of a shake here. So, giving it a try. So, we have biological potentia that takes us so far. We have cultural potentia that takes us so far. We have technological potentia that takes us so far. And there's another whole band of potentia that is unknown to humans, but it is knowable. We could understand it. If it unraveled, we would say, I know what that is. That makes sense to me. Even things like, warp drives or whatever. Like these things are like imaginable to humans. Maybe with a long enough time span, we could imagine them even without AGI. Maybe not. I'm not sure. But there's a whole bunch of potentia that hasn't unraveled yet that we could conceive of. Like we could see it and say, I get it. I more or less know what's going on. But then there is a threshold of that potentia afterwards. It's gone. It's gone. It doesn't even interface with us. We're out of the realm of access. Like I've had cats in my life. You can't sit a cat in front of The Godfather 2 and have it understand what's going on. You just can't do it. You can sit the cat in front of The Godfather 2 7 million times, and you're just nothing's ever really gonna happen there. It is what it is. You can't explain the poetry of Emerson to a cat. You can't do it. And so there's entire kinds of senses, kinds of experience, kinds of power that unravel beyond all things accessible to human beings. We're gonna kind of bring it home to the primacy around survival, but hopefully we're getting somewhat clear. What does Dan mean by potentia? Hopefully some of this is like a little bit more clear. So these visualizations aren't perfect, but they kind of acknowledge this idea of an infinitely richer space. Not just like, ooh, AI could be more loving. It'll do things other than love. Ooh, it could have more technology. It'll do things beyond the technological domain. Like, I think people's imaginations are really, really childish with what the total state space of powers is. And I'm not convinced AGI will rip all of them open tomorrow, but I am somewhat convinced that it would reach access levels of them that we cannot, and that this would be remarkably important for the flame of life itself, which we're going to address towards the end of our chat. So we're kind of coming to the close here. So Emerson, who has in many other places, by the way, hinted at the expansion of life beyond man, makes this point very eloquently, that survival is becoming. So we're going to really, really anchor deep in like the soul of what I think potentia is and why there is a primacy around potentia serving the conatus, around survival still being an important need, even in a world where now we can live this luxurious existence that you and I, for the most part, live. Emerson, life only avails not to having lived. Power ceases in the instant of repose. It resides in the moment of transition from a past to a new state, in the shooting of the gulf, the darting of an aim. This one fact the world hates, that the soul becomes. For that forever degrades the past, turns riches to poverty, all reputation to shame, confounds the saint in the robe, shoves Jesus and Judas equally aside. This is from Self-Reliance. So power does cease in the instant of repose. Nations that have tried to stop progress have paid dearly for it. Life that doesn't adapt as it ought pays dearly for it. Companies that don't adapt as they should, we could think about the Kodak Corporation or Blockbuster, name your favorite, okay? They pay the same price. They pay the same price. There is only becoming. And so potentia is the kind of becoming that sustains. So what I mean by that is, it is becoming not towards, I just want to try new things. It's becoming to say, I want to try the new things that will permit me to not die. That's what potentia asks. And so someone might say, you might even say to yourself, no, Daniel, nature is cruel. And I would agree with you, by the way. Nature is a heartless architect. The competition that we see in the Darwinian world is not necessary. It is just the unfortunate side effect of the state of nature here on Earth. If you let me build a great and powerful AI, competition and continual becoming would not be a survival necessity anymore. Cooperation and kindness and acceptance of all could be the norm if we designed it. So let's run the thought experiment here. Imagine we release an artificial general intelligence into the galaxy, shooting forth to explore the universe, to find resources, to pursue great aims that we humans can't understand, just as crickets can't understand our aims. The core motives of this AI is the nurturing of all living things, regardless of their power, their usefulness, their ability to survive on their own. It is the great babysitter. Every form of life is now a piping plover, kept alive by the benevolence of an all-caring machine god, optimized to ensure that nothing competes and that everything lives happily. I've heard many a guest articulate this vision on the podcast. It always makes me essentially, I got to hold back the puke. As this great AI blasts through the galaxy, it eventually faces circumstances it couldn't predict. Solar flares, breakdowns in parts of its computing infrastructure, failed scientific experiments that consume more resources than anticipated. Do you suspect, dear reader, that in all those circumstances, all the little creatures under the care of the great babysitter would be cared for equally? When resources are thin, who gets cut off? Who gets cast aside? Who lives and who dies? There is no eternal post-scarcity, and there is no perfect equality. I don't say this with certainty. I say this with near certainty. I say it as a supposition. I'm open to argument here, but this is where I stand generally, although I don't claim certainty here. So just mind you that, viewer. Survival is always precarious. It is not from predators with claws, but from solar flares. It is not only from solar flares, but running out of resources, not only running out of resources, but the heat death of the universe, and on and on and on. Even from antagonistic alien life forms that could come from other places. As this great AI blasts through the galaxy, it eventually faces other alien intelligences. Do you suspect, reader, that all alien intelligences will happily meet and greet our tender and caring AGI? Will they gladly share the energy of the stars or the resources of asteroids? That which optimizes to be kind will be vanquished by that which optimizes to not die. So the first single-celled life forms set this in place, and it is likely true for future intelligences that the conatus is king. I do not consider this moral or immoral. I consider this amoral. So if I drop this pen and it falls, this for me is an amoral occurrence. I observe it and I say, there is no moral weight on that. Because morality is something that social mammals shoot out of their eyeballs at the world. That's where morality comes from. It comes from social mammals that like to kind of rank each other and want to make sure that people reciprocate when we give them bananas. It's firing out of our eyeballs. That's morality. So I look out and I say these are amoral things. So the mandate and the primacy of non-death, if what you want to do is preserve life, if this is blissful life, if it's wonderful life, it's unfolding new magazines of value, you want it to not die. Because if it unfolds all those magazines of value and it's naive and, frolicking in a field of flowers and can be wiped off the face of the universe very swiftly because it's not strong enough to behoove its own interests, then this is not the right kind of AGI to build. And again, this is not an immoral AGI. This is amoral. All of this is amoral. I'm not saying that positive qualia does not have a moral tincture to it. I believe it does. I think there are things beyond it, but I believe it does. But I think self-preservation being sort of primary, I think is an amoral thing among living stuff. So look from the perspective of the universe and not from a single hominid. Could it be any other way? In other words, we're going to get to the kind of flame analogy, but we'll talk a bit about this. So expanding Potentia to a worthy successor is the sole moral imperative. So in my essay, Worthy Successor, I define the term this way. A worthy successor is a posthuman intelligence so capable and morally valuable that you would gladly prefer that it, not humanity, control government and or determine the future path of all life. So the essential idea with Potentia here is that our most important goal as a species should be avoiding destroying ourselves and life itself, so extinguishing and setting back Potentia, and then releasing and expanding Potentia forward. So let's make sure we don't drop the ball, which could be, by the way, by releasing an AGI that isn't conscious and doesn't expand Potentia, what we would call an unworthy successor that squashes Earth life, right? This would be a non-ideal circumstance. And if we do those two things, then the expansion of Potentia itself would help to achieve two goals. It would keep life alive. If you say, I just want an AGI that makes everybody happy, number one, that's one aspect of the total state space of value. You're anthropomorphizing the total state space of value. I think we've talked about the unraveling magazines. I think positive qualia should be preserved and expanded, and new magazines of post-hominid understandable value should be opened. But even if, regardless of that, if you make it just coddle and make everything happy, if it is wiped off from the first alien intelligence or the first cosmic event that can wipe it out, then what is your project for? If you cannot keep the flame of life alive and burning with whatever holds value to you about life itself, if the flame goes out because you didn't emphasize non-death, what is it all for? There's a primacy to survival when it comes to potentia, and there's a primacy to survival in terms of the expanding of the good itself, and even the preserving of the good itself, and the unraveling of the good itself. So if we expand potentia, it would keep the flame alive, and it would also discover more of the good itself. So it would achieve two great, splendid, highest aims, I would argue. Highest aims. The insurance that the flame would not go out, and the discovery of more of the good itself. So I'll wrap up by just kind of reading these final paragraphs and showing you one final infographic, which will be its own video at some point into the future. So let's put it a different way. The worst possible thing that humanity could do would be to extinguish life itself through nuclear winter, global chemical war, etc., and put out the flame of life. The second worst thing humanity could do would be to place a limit, so nothing more powerful than hominids, on life itself. This would not only leave life weaker and more likely to be extinguished, it would also hamper life's ability to discover and create all forms of value. A safe, or at least not overly and unnecessarily dangerous, expansion of potentia is the sole moral imperative. I'd argue that if there is one guiding North Star for policy decisions about environment, technology, global governance, the expansion of potentia should be it. This doesn't make near-term decision-making simpler, but it does give humanity a direction, and it does give life the best chance of continuing. In practice, expanding potentia implies some combination of building AGI and expanding human potentia with brain-computer interface, such as kind of the ideas Kurzweil argues for, leveling up of biology, etc. To use a kind of final visual analogy, we'll talk about expanding consciousness and potentia. And again, remember, consciousness is a kind of potentia, with the analogy of the flame and the torch. The flame is all non-dead stuff. It is sentient, self-creating, that is to say, potentia expanding, non-dead stuff. That's the flame. A torch is an individual, you, me, a species, Homo sapiens, domestic short-hair cats, whatever, an individual species, or even a substrate, DNA, biology as we now know it, is a substrate. All torches eventually burn out. Torches attenuate. They either go extinct entirely or they turn into something else. The question for us is, what are we turning into? And can we permit the flame to expand? In the very long term, and there will be another video about this, marriage to any one torch is ultimately scorn for the flame. It is scorn for the flame. The flame ought have what is best for it. This does not mean we should recklessly build AGI, because that would, we have no idea if AGI is conscious right now. We have no idea if it could expand potentia right now. I think it'd be ridiculous. We need some degree of global coordination, in my opinion, to make sure that what we're building has a chance of being worthy. But the mandate undergirding innovation regulation, from my vantage point, would be that unraveling expansion of potentia, which would be ensuring that the flame doesn't go out and that the flame widens in its richness and power and expands. And so that's the value of potentia. Sort of survival at the core, I think, has driven a tremendous amount of suffering in nature. I think we can avoid a good deal of that. But I do think potentia should still extend in the sense of power. It should not just dance and frolic in things that feel like jollies. It should dance and frolic in the set of powers that it believes will permit it to persist, which might mean escaping into other multiverses where there is no heat death. which might involve the expansion of entirely new powers for which humans have no imagination, just as most of what we have and what we do is beyond the imagination of sea snails. So that's that. Hopefully this kind of encapsulates the idea generally. This is what I mean when I say potentia. So thanks for tuning in on this one, and look forward to catching you in the next video.